first of all, I want to say thank you very much, John Paul, for agreeing to this interview. I was just delighted when you did agree to do this. I think you've known for some time that I'm a big admirer of your work, and both your academic work and especially because it comes out of your work as a practitioner around the world. And so sometimes I say, yeah, he's written 22 books, but what's really important is he's been to all these places and speaks from experience. And so I was at Eastern Mennonite University in your last year there and just picked up every course that you offered when I heard it was your last year. And you've profoundly shaped my orientation to this field and to life, well beyond what you probably recognize or know. And I think of that as a good thing. So first of all, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeremy. As you well know, you've influenced a few of those books yourself. So it's always fantastic when you actually end up following your students.
Yeah,
Um, Although most of them, like you, I can't really call students, I suppose.
you can.
They're more like teachers.
Well, but this is the thing, right? To always be teachers and learners and curious about how life works or how it doesn't work. So I thought maybe you could start by giving a little bit of your story. Um, you want to take over that?
Sure. Well, yeah, I assume it may have various pieces that you might be interested in, so I'll just start on the simplest end. Um, I grew up within a Mennonite community and foundation, so my faith tradition has always been within that community that I have stayed close to and has greatly influenced my work. Um, was very fortunate that nearly 36 years ago now, I met Wendy, who is a life partner and wife, and we have two wonderful children. Angie and is now married to Jeff Yoder, and Josh is pretty far along in a pretty significant relationship with Josie Kramer. So we're blessed to have a great family. My professional background, as you know, initiated way back when I was pretty young. I actually had a long hiatus between my sophomore and junior year of college to do essentially a form of voluntary service abroad that was at that time still a program that was in lieu of the very end of the Vietnam War. The draft that I wasn't directly affected by in terms of my lottery birthday being chosen, but I took great advantage of the remains of the program and ended up starting a deep interest and a lot of relationships internationally from that translated into being able to combine my deep passion and vocation around peace building with actually being in a lucky position we could do this professionally as time went on. And have stayed close to that all of my career, as you say, a practitioner, scholar. My early years were all practitioner. I came into teaching at EMU and then eventually at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. And have been fortunate to be able to, I suppose, negotiate the arrangements that permitted me to both teach and retain an active connection to practical applications in various places and continents. Although I guess it's now close to 15, 18 years, have made a pretty intentional choice to narrow where I was working and to stay longer. So I have a few places now that I stay pretty connected to. I touch on a lot of other locations through relationships and former students and people that know me, but I have just completed a better part of 12 years of work in Nepal. I continue to work very closely with Colombia, which is one of those countries that dates all the way back into the 80s, for me, the late 80s. And with my current position of sort of finishing an academic career, I'm probably headed into emeritus status in the not too distant future.
Nice.
I've actually navigated over to be senior fellow at Humanity United, which is a philanthropy that works on two big areas. One is ending modern day slavery, and the other is peace building. And so I am able. A part of that has to do with trying to find ways to elegantly conclude some of the hard travel that I've had to do in order to be more available to Wendy, as she is now in her 8th year of the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, which has affected our ways of doing things, although she's still, I think, somewhat ahead of the curve due to a very proactive engagement through a variety of therapies and exercise. It still, touches all aspects of life.
Sure.
In our family. So I'm kind of at that place where opportunities are many, but I have to be judicious in how I engage and take them up. And but it's been, that's been a lot of my work professionally to come to that final piece. The practices in the field of peace building and conflict transformation tend to be a person who's worked more at community levels, although in places around the world that have had pretty significant levels of violence. Though over the last years, of course, I've had a lot of opportunity to work at higher levels of political peace process and peace accord work, which all of that makes for a very rich and interesting life and keeps you full of questions.
Yes.
Because no matter what you do, it doesn't all seem to work out the way you think it's going to.
Well, this was one of the learnings from you. We call, as students, I think you had some formal academic name for the class, but as students we called it story time with John Paul.
Yeah,
and, it was entering into these complexities and surprises and making some guesses, and then okay, well, tomorrow I'm going here, so let's see what we should do about this. Yeah, and I wanted to echo the piece on Wendy that you've been in the States and I've been in Canada, but my the time that Huntington's has been on the horizon has almost mirrored that time that you guys have been facing Parkinson's. Yeah. And being in the same field, I've often wondered, I wonder how you guys are doing, but also, what wisdom unfolds in the midst of that kind of trying to figure out how to live well in a situation that's radically changing.
Yeah.
In terms of a loved one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And likewise, we've thought of you often, Jeremy, because it was such a surprise to hear. And there's some similarities, obviously, but these things are so challengingly idiosyncratic that you soon discover that there are some big patterns, and you can share out with a lot of people things that are happening, but you have to have this capacity to adapt to what the particular contours that any individual faces. And of course, between you and I'm on the side of sort of more on the caretaker, accompanier.
Yeah.
And you would be in the same boat as Wendy of actually waking up every day and facing those things that you can't fully control and don't know where they're going to go next.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes I don't know if I would apply the word wisdom. I may have wisdom in some other areas. This one is like the hardest learning curve that I've ever had, because no matter what you feel like you're doing, it's sort of responding to things that are so unpredictable and that are new. It's like a new landscape that you've never walked before.
Yeah.
And it makes it very, very challenging because it doesn't always feel very wise. It feels, to some degree, it feels sort of reactive. Mm-hmm. And it feels that you think you're adapting to something, only to discover that wasn't it, and you got to do something different. And it comes into life without announcement. And that means specifically that other parts of life you can't kind of hold in exactly the same way you did before, but you're not sure what to do about that.
Yeah.
And so there's frustrations on all sides as you figure it out, and there are obviously moments of great great care and joy, but it's I don't know what other words to use except it's never easy,
No.
and sometimes it's not easily seen by people from the outside because some of these things are not. A lot of it's not visible,
Yeah.
so it floats in a world that's less than visible. In Wendy's case, of course, the tremor is quite visible when it's on, but she's been able to control a lot of that through combinations of medicine and acupuncture. Um, but those actually, the tremor sometimes is rarely the more difficult part of it,
Sure.
and that less than visible is the hardest
Well,
because you
let's
live
talk
on.
about that a little bit because the my observation is the doctors are most comfortable talking about the visible because they can measure tremors or they can measure, movements in my case, but the people that are facing these diseases, if it was just movements, my goodness,
Yeah,
that would be a lot easier to figure out, some how to work with that. So let's talk a little bit about that invisible stuff.
yeah,
How do you experience it? We talk about the moving target, like you were talking about. You're never, even if you find something that works once, doesn't necessarily mean that it works the next time, right?
yeah, yeah. No, exactly. Well, Wendy often refers to some of what she experiences internally as the internal jitters,
Okay.
which uh, have her in a feeling sometimes like she drank 8 cups of coffee too many all at one shot. In other words, it's kind of like a sensation, and it runs down her left side internally in her leg, which it can be very, very bothersome, almost like she's got something crawling underneath the skin, but it's not. Nobody notices it particularly. But I think the harder ones are actually that, and I don't know in your case how this plays out, but in our bodies, the second, if not the most significant hub of nerves is around the whole digestive system, the gut, which is why quite often we talk about feeling something or responding from the gut or having an
Mm-hmm.
intuition. Those are actually a lot of those terms are quite accurate in that your body has a nervous system that is also very much a part of how you're responding to the world. But in the case of Parkinson's, those are affected in ways that everything slows down, becomes much more difficult. So nutrition, eating, the normal things of sort of daily life become much less controlled and predictable.
Yeah.
Um, it's That's one of the harder things is that you can say you have a really good day and on day. That doesn't necessarily translate into the next day. It could go for 3 or 4 days, and you think, "Wow, I'm onto something." But
Yeah.
then that can come, and when you sort of come out of what might be a routine, doing things that you want to do, like maybe travel or visit or have friends or whatever, those can actually have an impact that nobody notices at the time because you seem perfectly well at that moment.
Yeah.
But for days after, sometimes it can have a real impact.
Yeah.
For obviously, my guess is that maybe Huntington's is a little more on this, but certainly in Parkinson's, the cognitive capacities begin to be very. You said when we first started that later in the day it gets more foggy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So fatigue sets in very quickly and can be very severe and unpredictably so in the course of a day. Um, and the biggest thing that I've noticed alongside of her is that everything around her feels like it's moving fast. And part of it is I feel like everything is moving much slower.
Hmm.
Decision making, handling multiple criteria. Grocery shopping, for example, became very clear at some point that she gets completely worn out in places where there's too much happening at one time or too much
Yeah.
stimuli. So
Yeah.
walking an aisle and looking up and down and across actually brings fatigue, dizziness, and what they refer to as cognitive fatigue. The brain just gets tired and doesn't process.
I experience all of that. So
Yeah,
far, I still do grocery shopping, but the family's learned to text me list
yeah,
because I can't remember anything, and I only go to the same place where I know everything where it is, and
yeah,
I can go to a new place, but it takes a lot out of me.
yeah. No, exactly. For example, we can't go to movie theaters anymore.
Okay.
That the something about the stimulus of that space, the sound, and the
Mm,
combination of the proximity of the images is just really
too much.
overwhelming. Same. I mean, one of the things that's been pretty hard is and hard to explain is that church is complicated.
Hmm.
It's too many conversations at once, even if they're ones you want and they're well intended.
Yeah.
It's just something about that. Any of it, so it's not church per se. Any kind of a group setting. She'll go to a Parkinson's support group and come home just absolutely exhausted.
Yeah.
And I'm just not sure it's worth going back. And it's partly because there's just a lot of stuff that starts to happen at one time. That I certainly know that the capacity to handle what we might consider to be, and she certainly was highly capable of, daily decisions, what to put on today.
Yeah.
If you've got a whole slew of choices, it suddenly becomes tiring.
Sure.
To so she's sort of in a process actually the last year or two. She enjoys, in particular, shopping for deals in consignment shops and then using those as ways that she can generate a little bit of income because she's now fully retired.
Right.
Um,
She's
and
done this for quite a number of years, right?
Yeah, she's always worked, and was the head of a shop at 10,000 villages and worked a lot. She had to give up she had developed a jewelry business with both herself and some folks from around the world that we would meet who were
Mm.
artisans. And a lot of that was actually where first things began to show up. Her hands would cramp and she couldn't do what she was normally
Fine
doing.
motor. Yeah.
Yeah. But what she's in a process really of trying to bring everything to a more simple level.
Hmm.
We're just, and I think we'll be in that for a year or two here, but going through closets and of course that comes into life when kids still have a lot of their stuff here and they're not
Sure.
quite that settled. And so we've got all that, that normal flow of things that are happening. But yeah, those are the things I noticed that are hard to
No,
pass.
and a lot of that I identify with from Wendy's side, but for her, and I'll speak for myself. Uh, in I think Rana has a much harder path. I think the caregiver often has a much harder path than the other one because, like for me, things do slow down and I get foggy and I just can't do anything. So at some point I'm avoiding those wider social settings, but none of those internal things. I'm living a life that makes sense to my internal, uh, you know, awareness of what I'm able to do, but that's not actually true for Rana in the way that it used to be true.
Yeah, yeah. No, I would agree. Although I think it's probably a two-way street. Um, I of course these last years have been working more remotely and from home a good portion of time. And so her watching me do what is I experience it as pretty normal. I mean, you always have
Hmm.
difficult conversations and hard decisions. Those are all part of the kind of work
Sure.
that we've been involved in. Um, but I don't experience it, with exception. You usually, I mean, was always the case that you'd sort of spout off about things you were frustrated with, and that was a normal part of, sharing in married life.
Hmm.
Basically, people knew that, wow, that's frustrating or irritating or whatever. But now it feels to her like it's just an overwhelming amount of things. If she overhears a conversation
Yeah.
or other things. That's certainly true. I you know to I find that I have to. more intentionally slow myself down. And I have, we always talk about failing in order to learn. Well, I have failed miserably and I'm still learning because things still feel like we could move this along a little quicker or we could get something done more here.
Mm-hmm.
And I've found that if the circumstances are such that they're not moving quickly, sit down in a chair and grab a notebook or your iPhone, do some emails that you were planning to do after you went out and came back, or that you just have to take it as it comes. But that's
Yeah.
not easy to do,
No.
certainly. But I think on the other side, I have to say, John, one of the things I quite often, I'll wake up in the morning or in the midst of a conversation where it's pretty clear that we're experiencing something very differently. And I also find myself reminding myself of how, even though this is the person that I have been the closest to for 36 years, I really have no idea what it's like to be inside her body and to
Mm-hmm.
feel the things that are
Mm-hmm.
going on or to even give words to it. Yeah, much less that, I mean, certainly probably closer than others and can find ways of expressing it, but um, it's amazing how you're alongside of somebody that you know really well, and yet you really don't fully comprehend
Yeah.
what it feels like and how it's penetrating to what level, et cetera, what things it's taken.
It's interesting because with Huntington's, it's genetic, right? So I've watched generations before me deal with it, including my mom that died when she was 58.
Mm.
But I forgot where I was going with that. Um,
Now, you said Huntington's was genetic. So you've seen certain patterns as a person who's watched it happen, I imagine. But you
sure,
probably
and
that was yeah.
in my case, I was became the primary caregiver for my mom,
Uh-huh.
and she was very much in denial about having it, and so that made it really complicated to figure out how to
Yeah.
support. And so some of the path that I've taken of kind of expecting that I have it, of let's embrace, like when I got diagnosed, we decided to have a big party. We called it a mover shaker party. We told our originally I wanted everybody to bring some food like Jello or martinis or something that you can't control, and we had some 100 people at our house to celebrate uh, this thing, and people were more comfortable celebrating who I was in the past than what. It's complicated. We don't know how to mark these kinds of changes, but
Yeah.
it seemed to embrace it was at least a way to put it as part of a path or a dance that we could do together, and that does affect, you know, our life and all of our relationships.
Yeah.
So we try and negotiate that together, and uh, some days it's even fun,
Yeah.
uh, and but not every day.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And um, one of the hardest things that I find is how to, because people very well intended, the most often asked question is, how's Wendy?
Yeah.
Or how's Wendy doing? And those that have less understanding about um, what Parkinson's is are assuming that somehow the medical world that they'll find something that takes care of all of this, and
Yeah.
so they'll be looking for signs that she's overcoming or she's better or
Yeah.
etc. Very hard question to answer, nearly impossible.
Well,
Um,
well, that uh, the it's interesting how violence is wrapped in with this. Like the motif people are most comfortable with is fight it.
yeah,
How's the battle going?
Yeah, exactly.
And for incurable conditions, that way of framing it, just there's no life, no possibility of a good walking in a good way.
Yeah.
Uh, so you've had to think about other ways that we could think about these things.
No, that's exactly right. And one of the, it's interesting because some of in Parkinson's, and I don't know for Huntington's, but in Parkinson's, there's a good bit of scientific evidence that various forms of exercise can really make a difference in either slowing or, in some cases, for people reversing a few of the
Mm-hmm.
symptoms they may have. And a lot of the language that, well, so bicycling is one of the biggest. Any form of exercise works, but there's some real interesting things around biking. So we've gotten into biking as much as we can, which is it's been a big boost for our family and for me in particular. I'm in better shape through the months that I can bike. Winter months are a little harder, but
Yeah.
I have been for decades. But ironically, boxing has proven to be. There's a whole set of things that apparently happen. But Wendy's been reluctant to jump into boxing. There are a few that are pushing her. But the people who develop the really rigorous programs often refer to them as boot camps, and
Hmm.
it's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of metaphor of exactly what you're saying. And the other side of that sometimes is, of course, what we know about the power of how you yourself are coming around facing what it is that you have, and the sort of attitudes and perspective that you bring with it is really significant. But it's also very hard
Mm-hmm.
because people can look at somebody who's real exemplar, like Michael J. Fox, for example, and they see him in the TV interview when he's
Sure.
doing his very, I mean, he's obviously got dyskinesia and going every which direction. And he's pretty honest about some things when he gets down to it, and his writings certainly are.
Yeah.
But people look to him as a person of enormous inspiration and optimism, which I think he does embrace, and he's been a great spokesperson for the movement. But it makes it doubly hard for other people who are like him, are going to have those 80% of the time it's not fun.
Yeah.
90%,
Yeah.
95% of the time it's not that 1 minute cameo,
Right.
and that's tough when people kind of hint that you should be optimistic like so and so,
Sure.
or so and so, and she seems to really be doing well, or so and so does it this way. And suddenly everything feels like it's a part of, your perceptions are a bit hypersensitive anyway, but is this a form? And what if I'm not happy about this?
Well, exactly.
What if I hate the guts out of this thing? And it's taken so much. I think one of the things I've said is that it felt to me like this was not a disease that is lightning, where you're given a diagnosis that you've got 6 months because you've got cancer,
Yeah.
or that you've got a heart attack, and if you do X, Y, and Z, you can really bring yourself to the other side of it. This is kind of, in one of my pieces of poetry somewhere I once wrote, it's like winter seeping in. You hardly even notice it from day to day. It's like a thief in the night. You
Mm-hmm.
don't notice that something went missing until suddenly you discover that you can no longer do that. It's like a slow, kind of a slow violence, which it's like, kind of like climate change. We all know it's there, but it's coming. It's
Yeah.
if it would happen so radically at one moment, everybody would jump up and look at it. But because it has all of these patterns that require you to look across half centuries, if not multiple centuries, it isn't noticed in the same way. And I think that this is very much what it feels like,
Yeah.
and it's one of the harder things to explain. Is that you can look really good and be
Mm-hmm.
really alive and even mobilize into coherence for periods of time, which is more often than not when you're interacting with people that you care about or you want to be with. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
What's not seen is all the things that happen after that, the energy that it took, and that are the more common day-to-day things that are happening and are not easily explained.
Yeah. When my mum died, my brother and I spoke at her funeral, and we both spoke plainly about what we had experienced. And I think it was only then we learned that you weren't supposed to tell the truth in funerals.
Yeah.
But also, this piece that you're talking about, that people legitimately had a different experience of my mum than what we had, and
Yeah.
our story was quite surprising to them because of exactly those dynamics of seeing in glimpses, and we have an interest to make ourselves look you know good.
Yeah, absolutely.
uh,
Yeah.
so these are
There,
all
there,
fascinating.
I think
Rana
there is.
once said she wished I had cancer instead of
Yeah.
Huntington's, and of course that's no solution. But that more intense piece, it's a little. We know how to accompany someone through uh, an episode where you're in the hospital
Yeah.
and you are dying, or you're in the hospital and you need help. We know what to do then, and people ask us, how can we help, and they honest, like good friends. And it's hard to know with that really slow winter creeping, as you said,
Yeah.
how in the midst of that
Yeah.
uh, do you find answers.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. That your comment about speaking truth inappropriately, or probably in this case very appropriately, because it's about an honesty at moments when they may most matter. But I think for the most part, it's not easy for people to. I mean, it's easier simply to say, she's doing well, she's ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
But we're pretty serious on the things that we have to deal with in the life changes that are coming. So it's not a yeah, it's never very easy.
Yeah.
Very easy in those.
So, in the midst of that never very easy, I'm curious, uh, are there things in the field of peace and conflict transformation studies, like you've been looking at violence and peace and reconciliation? Uh, is any of that relevant to your path, or are you again learning anew?
Well, you certainly learn anew. This is more challenging because it sits right at home. Home was always the place you came where you could just let down, be yourself, and um, have the great safety of, you not having to put on too many airs or facades for any particular reason. And that comes with all its goodness and its warts, as we know. The home scene is fantastic. But that in this case, so there are a number of things that I notice that I started to gravitate toward. I think they're actually pointing in the direction of, as you know, my approach to peace building is pretty eclectic. I will draw from almost any source that I feel has inspiration into this, whether it's off to the creative arts and poetry, or spider webs, or walking. Particularly in the moral imagination, I wandered pretty widely around our challenge not being whether we can become good professional technocrats,
Mm-hmm.
but whether we can become the artists of change that will be required for these impossible situations. There are elements, I think, within that I find very parallel. So, if I maybe one or two, I have. So I have always worked in poetry, though I've never gone about this as a process of trying to publish professionally. Maybe someday down the line I'll pull some things together. But I did start a process of noticing moments and snippets of conversation that seemed to be particularly revealing, that came in a poetic fashion, sort of that what I refer to sometimes as the poetic listening, where somebody or something emerges in a conversation that captures sort of a core quality of something that is very complex and difficult to put your finger on. That often comes forward in haiku or
Mm-hmm.
in a form of sort of poetic expression. And so I've been tracking that. One small discipline is to have, and it's maybe the hardest one, is to keep track of that well enough that I have somewhere embedded in the midst of that at least one poem that captures that year.
Hmm.
So because this is more about, something in the range of possibly, we hope, 20 to 30 years, you can never predict how these will go, but
Of
people don't
course.
usually die directly of Parkinson's, but there are things that will happen that shut down that becomes the case.
Yeah.
But um, to take it's a form of sort of winter creeping reflection, if you will. I mean, so if you find one of those, I go back and I notice that. So I've been sort of even titling them, this 2016 and 2015 and 2014, except it's in a hidden folder that nobody looks at.
That's
I've
wonderful.
gone about. I have on occasion pulled a few out for some public speaking things because I think they illustrate what I'm
Yeah.
after. Last year, um, during the course of the year, I made it a goal to take a photo with my iPhone and write a haiku of a particular moment throughout any 300, the full year, 350, how many days in the year are there? 354, two, whatever it is. And I was able to complete that, and I compiled a little volume that were more around sort of the haiku process around nature and sort of day-to-day observations as they bridged over into peace building. What I didn't put in that book were that there also were a handful of those that had to do directly with the Parkinson's,
Okay.
and they were, yeah, part of that other piece. But that sort of discipline leads me to where I think the other piece is. I always thought that I had a certain level of patience, capacity for listening, and humility. Now, I might be a little too proud of those things. good, good Mennonite fashion, probably.
Yeah.
I discovered I had very low thresholds, much
Yeah.
lower than I thought, because those could be more easily mobilized when I needed them in the context of something that I was engaged with others. When it got so close to touching home,
Yeah.
I discovered my well was not very deep. And that was a little startling, to notice how impatient I can get, to notice how quickly I can jump to judgment or shutting off or not listening. And I think sometimes that's much easier to do close to home than it is out when you're
Mm-hmm.
with others. Or
Hmm.
my view of humility, as you know, has always been that humility is really about sustaining curiosity. And that sustained curiosity is about an unfolding truth that none of us has ever fully arrived at. And, this, for as much as I would like, when you actually live side by side with something that is unfolding of this nature, it is much more frustrating than you would like. You would like the doctor to say, "This is what will make a difference. Do this," or
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, if you could just shift to something that would do that, and even become sort of authoritarian around it. And
Prescriptive.
yeah, very prescriptive in that that notion of it. And so I found that the alongsideness with Wendy and the Parkinson's was reflecting more on me at times than on the
Mm.
disease, much so. And that's it's never very easy. I work at it endlessly,
Yeah.
uh, and I feel like I don't accomplish it very well. Actually, it's amazing how. So a lot of these exercises, in part, were about self-reflection, and I've always been a quasi hermit anyway. But that was certainly a part of what's there.
Mm-hmm.
I've thought this year one thing I would do. In fact, when we went down to Santa Fe for a few days over the Christmas break. It's a 6 to 7 hour drive from here, and in one of the art galleries, I went in and just bought a whole slew of really gorgeous cards. And I sort of have in mind, I've always loved good pens. I don't have the money to spend them on really good pens, but a decent pen. So I have a collection of it. I thought I'm going to break out some of my collection, and maybe once a week or every 2 weeks, I'm just going to take one of these cards, and I'm going to do more on this. What I think is true that I've been reading more and more about the power of gratitude, and just write a note to someone. So you may get a note in the mail here, Jeremy, in a few weeks, just to say thanks for this conversation. But I've started it. I did one just a few days ago, and this actually is a practice of slowing down, and maybe that's Wendy's big gift.
Well, there's so much talk about the present, and usually talk by people that are swept away in the future. Preoccupied with what they think they should be doing about the present moment. But it gives a completely different sense of time and way of being present. But I was thinking, remembering that when in one of your classes you did some listening skills, where the main rule was nobody's allowed to talk. You have to prove that you're listening profoundly, deeply, but you can't use words. And I'm not exactly sure why. Like it leads towards how do you be curious in the present, but also how do you use your presence in a way that honors the other. And that doesn't have to be a whole bunch of words. In fact, the words sometimes mix us up, but that gift of presence is a profound one, I think.
Yeah, no, I haven't only in some recent writing and articles. I haven't gotten it into. I'm working on a book that's just very, very slow in coming fully out, but it has a lot to do with this notion that much of the ways that we engage our work have not attended well to the question of quality of presence. The honing of skills and the preparation of analysis and the capacity for design of process and the engagement with proposals is not to minimize any of that. But I just have felt increasingly that so much of it has to do with quality of what people feel intuitively about the nature of the space and the intention, the motivation, the direction of the space itself, the presence. And that is, I mean, that's where I say maybe my book has slowed down because my well was too shallow to actually know it, because I'm still learning so much about that. Because I think it's precisely, I mean, I know Wendy has expressed many times the sort of appreciation for the quality of both care and caregiving that is done even in the midst of it not being the most ideal. Still about the travel and the intensity of work, and not having quite completed a career with exciting things happening. That sort of thing just goes on, but it is. I think what you're putting your finger on is really about this. And we use, so much this word accompaniment. Just yesterday in a meeting, somebody said, okay, what's your definition of accompaniment? And as you know, from some of my work, I've always just simply fallen back to the word alongside. It's a quality of alongsideness, not ahead, not behind, not, pushing from a distance. And I think that could not be more accurate for what the relationship between the person who's facing the disease and the caregiver that's alongside. And it comes with a lot of challenges, but that certainly, it seems to me there's a lot of parallel between things that we're talking about. So just occurred to me that maybe the reason this book is not coming out is precisely because I just haven't gotten far enough to feel like with integrity I can speak to some of this in words that are authentic and honest enough around it. Who
Well,
knows?
and that's the hard thing. Like anytime we develop role models or someone we think is doing it, something, holding out something as the, often hide all the shadows underneath, and how to give the shadows its proper voice in the midst of it is a challenge, especially when it's not just your own shadows, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about what you've learned from the field. I'm also curious. You began by talking about being a Mennonite.
Hmm.
Um, uh, what what has your faith tradition, has that helped or challenged, or probably both? But
Yeah.
and yeah, what how is that going?
Yeah. Well, I think, our the most difficult part of this is that the ways in which we would have normally um, conducted our location for worship and relationships has become much more complicated. Um, so I experienced this in particular much more through pretty close friendships that permit a different level of
Mm-hmm.
conversation. A couple of people in particular that are in that direction. Certainly, the faith side. I think there is a continuous offer and availability of community and family within our fold. It's always been one of the markers. Um, it's not easy with this, but like you were saying earlier, the hospital stay,
Mm-hmm.
bringing
Mennonites are good for that.
7 days of taking care of your food needs is
Yeah,
easily done. We aren't sure how to ask
yeah,
and to describe, and many others are not sure what to offer. And I think that's one of the difficulties of the particular nature
sure it
of
is.
these. I imagine this cuts across things that would be like Alzheimer's and dementia. Various of the neurological based diseases probably have elements of this that are similar, that can be very slow moving and
Yeah.
not easily not easily sorted out. I think for me, so if I just take notice, that's one of the things I try to do, is to look at where my attention has gone and where I'm drawing resource. And probably one of the themes alongside that quality of presence theme was the notion that um, faith is also about um, the sense of awe that is captured in the mystery of the extraordinary gift of life and the world we were born into. Nature in particular
Mm-hmm.
often brings that for me, and that we don't always have good practices around ways that we uh, see that in a more daily way. And so a lot of my faith things have been less communal and more about in depth, either in a more in depth conversation. I find that true to be with a couple of people now that I have relationship with who are in a similar boat as I am. That is, they're
Mm-hmm.
accompanying a family member in one form or another, or have come through um, I refer to it. I did a talk on this a while back for the organization Humanity United that I work with, and I had this little phrase that we need we need our daily dose of vitamin awe. In other words, that we tend to see awe as something we do maybe once a year. We'll go
Yeah.
to on a vacation, or we'll go out to the river that one, like you did this morning. So I'm imagining that you're walking. When you said I walked on water today, that tells me that you are a person who has been nurturing your daily dose of vitamin awe. And I don't know why it is that we tend not to have that as a very core practice of it. If I experience it, to be very honest, if I experience it within the congregational setting, it almost always is around singing.
Mm-hmm.
That is, there's something that has that element that's always been there. It
Sure.
tends to be the only time that we lose sight of all of our differences, for example, which is really sort of an amazing phenomena. But that, so to me, uh, I think one of the big challenges is how not to become um, sort of callous or cynical,
Mm-hmm.
bitter.
Mm-hmm.
Callous is that you do things that just keep it at bay. You're not going to be touched by this thing.
Right.
Cynical is you might use all kinds of things to not actually have to go very deep in how painful this is. And bitter is you know how painful it is and you're angry. And
Mm-hmm.
somebody has done something to you that has to. And I think there aren't very many remedies for that when it's the winter creep,
Sure.
unless you have a vitamin A,
Yeah.
because it's the only thing that keeps all of a sudden everything pops open alive again.
Well,
And
and
how
it's
you find
I
is
find that interesting because the so many of the practices, well, especially of Mennonites, the focus on the communal acts of the church, and if you're in a place where being around that many people just is a non-starter, uh, that some of that stuff can just seem irrelevant. But the the to try and wake up with a sense of awe and to fill up that well daily, that's something I know I have the capacity. Like, of course I'm going to screw up, but I know I have that capacity, and
yeah,
I know that when I follow it, it can be playful, it can be of awe-inspiring. I
yeah,
haven't quite figured out why awful is a bad
yeah,
thing.
yeah. Or why I had a friend that told me from South Africa he doesn't like how often the word awesome is used because it diminishes
Yeah,
the awe when people use it to describe everything.
yeah,
But I think yeah, it has a lot to do. It is I think a form of mindfulness,
sure.
a mindfulness practice because what it is about is it's letting awe back into your life. It's there. It's there and present in almost everything around us every day, but we so rarely. So for me, that's been one of the things that has, I think, been pretty consistent in this. Probably why I navigate often toward poetry.
Yeah.
I think the that sort of impulse, I think, draws out a bit more of that element, at least for me.
It's interesting. Thich Nhat Hanh has a great little book that he came from when he was in Maryland prison trying to teach mindfulness to the
Uh-huh.
prisoners, and he was trying to make exactly these points that there, you can walk and you can walk when you're not in prison. You can walk as if you live your life as if you're a prisoner, or walk as if you're a prisoner. But it's also possible in prison to live as if you're free, because you are. And so he starts listing the blue sky and all of these things, and then it's time to stop, and all the prisoners go to eat, and they just scarf everything down. And he had just been trying to teach them mindfulness, and
Yeah,
talks about he realized how much he needed to learn, and
yeah,
this was
exactly.
not yet working. But the
Yeah,
the idea of um, taking a step in freedom, even if all of your surroundings are telling you something different, right?
yeah,
Something
yeah.
beautiful about that.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right.
Well,
Yeah.
I know we're at the end of our time. Is there anything else you wanted to throw in there?
Oh my, I don't know. I think I probably have added most of it. It's an extraordinary journey. It's new every day, and unfortunately, it's old every day.
Yes.
uh, yeah, it's. I think one of the things we keep working at is how not to live in ways that you don't have regrets, in the sense that I mean, we talk about this quite a bit. We're sort of at that stage where we're asking questions about retirement and
Mm-hmm.
what kind of living locations might be better for what we know is coming. And that what you were saying earlier about placing things into the future, how to bring that future now, the past that lies before, or that whole notion that it's simultaneous and right
Mm-hmm.
here, and that we should not defer until tomorrow the extraordinary things that can be taken up no matter what today. Um, I think this journey, and Wendy reminds me of this a lot. I mean, for her, obviously, she's saying sort of the message that we can't really say, well, we'll get to that when, because we have no idea what the when is going to look like.
Yeah.
You know, so what can we do to bring more of that in now?
Yeah.
And I think that that sort of reminder actually has been um, very, very challenging, but very useful
Yeah.
because it's, yeah, it couldn't be more true.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's fantastic. Well, let's leave the last word with Wendy then.
yeah, very.